Hello. Hi everyone, I'm Lao Gao. Recently, many viewers have asked about Japan releasing nuclear wastewater. Today, we'll review and explain this issue. A few days ago, Japan announced their plan to release treated wastewater from nuclear plants into the ocean, gaining global attention. As you know, in March 2011, Japan faced a magnitude 9.23 earthquake, causing a tsunami that hit the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. I was in Tokyo and felt the quake myself. Since then, the Fukushima plant has been in a rescue phase. Of course, this rescue isn't about saving the Fukushima nuclear plant, but letting it fully cease to exist to stop further pollution. Japan estimates it will take 30 to 40 years to seal it off. If it were just time, it would be manageable. The issue is, the plant was built underground, leading to daily inflow of groundwater, rainwater, and cooling water, creating a large volume of contaminated water with significant radioactive substances. Water like this is produced at a rate of 180 tons per day, and it cannot be directly discharged into the ocean. Currently, Japan's approach is to purify this contaminated water. They use a machine called ALPS to remove the main radioactive substances. The water once treated is referred to as treated water. However, without the consent of the International Atomic Energy Agency, this treated water cannot be discharged into the ocean either. Japan has been storing this treated water in enormous tanks for the past 10 years, with thousands of them now located in Fukushima, collectively holding over 2 million tons. It is anticipated that these tanks will reach their full capacity by the next October, prompting the Japanese government to devise a plan to release this treated water into the ocean. Although the majority of radioactive substances have been removed, tritium still remains, which is particularly challenging to eliminate. Tritium, being an isotope of hydrogen, mixes with regular water, transforming it all into tritium water, akin to the difficulty of separating sand and pebbles from water. It's relatively straightforward, yet attempting to separate the ink from the water proves to be quite challenging. Truly, if you wish to extract it, it's not that there is no method whatsoever. There are a few techniques, one of which is distillation. This tritium, although it is an isotope of hydrogen and nearly indistinguishable from hydrogen, is marginally heavier. Consequently, it can be concentrated through distillation repeatedly. This approach is viable, but it demands a significant amount of money, a substantial amount of time, and cannot be executed on a large scale. Treating such a large volume of water, like through distillation, means you can't distill too much at once. With over 2.3 million tons, it's just impossible to process it all. Another method considers its half-life, which is short for radioactive substances, only 12.4 years. This means if you wait 12.4 years, the tritium content will naturally drop by half, and after 60 years, 97% of the tritium will be gone. So theoretically, if Japan could store this treated water for 60 years, the issue wouldn't be too big. Japan's issue isn't just about not maintaining it for 60 years, but rather, every day, a large amount of contaminated water is being produced, and there's no place to store it anymore. Now, speaking of which, what kind of radioactive substance is tritium? In terms of radioactive intensity, it is considered a relatively weak radioactive substance. For metals like plutonium or uranium, we need lead plates to block their radiation, but for tritium, a piece of paper can block it. Additionally, tritium naturally exists in the environment. If cosmic rays hit the ocean or rivers, lakes and seas, or even clouds, tritium can be naturally produced. However, the amount of naturally produced tritium is quite small and has almost no effect on the human body. It's quite harmful, and the radioactivity of tritium is not a good thing. However, tritium has a downside in that it may be carcinogenic. Whether it is definitely carcinogenic is still debated, but the possibility is quite alarming, right? Therefore, Japan's plan to discharge the treated water from Fukushima into the ocean has met with strong opposition from many countries. Of course, Japan wants to release this treated water into the ocean. It's not entirely without basis. Firstly, currently, any nuclear power plant generates similar treated water. That is to say, even without any malfunctions, a normal nuclear power plant produces this kind of treated water daily. For this treated water, the International Atomic Energy Agency has a standard. As long as the tritium content is below its standard value, you can discharge it naturally into the ocean or rivers. So as long as nuclear power plants are in operation now, the surrounding areas will naturally accompany these treated waters. So fundamentally, nuclear power plants are pollution sources. If it wasn't polluted, it wouldn't be radioactive. It would be green energy, right? Japan's point is that if we can reduce the concentration of this treated water to below the usual levels everyone discharges, then perhaps it could be released. In fact, for the past 10 years, the Fukushima nuclear power plant has been under the supervision of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and international experts have been discussing for a decade how Japan should handle this nuclear wastewater. I recall back in the year 2016, 5 distinct solutions were put forward, which were the outcomes of extensive discussions by the world's leading experts in the field. One proposed solution involved excavating a pit that was 2,500 meters deep, which would extend beyond the groundwater level. The plan was to pour the treated nuclear water, meaning the water that only contains trace elements, directly into this deep pit, allowing it to flow 2,500 meters beneath the surface. At that depth, there is nothing but magma and similar substances that might potentially absorb it. The second solution proposed was to construct a very tall chimney and continuously apply heat to the water. Then, the steam, which is radioactive steam, drifts into the air, into the atmosphere, using the atmosphere to dilute it. The third solution is to dilute it with seawater, which involves pumping in a large amount of seawater to dilute the treated water until it can no longer be diluted, making it almost indistinguishable from seawater, and then discharging it into the ocean. The fourth solution is because it is treated water. It is water. So by mixing it with cement, it will form cement blocks, and then you can find a place to bury these radioactive cement blocks. Another solution is to use chemical reactions or electrolysis. For example, a chemical reaction could involve combining carbon monoxide with water to produce hydrogen and carbon dioxide. Electrolysis would directly generate hydrogen and oxygen. The hydrogen is radioactive, but the oxygen is not, right? The oxygen can be directly released into the atmosphere. The radioactive hydrogen, due to the fact that hydrogen is less dense than air, would ascend directly to elevated altitudes if released, so it wouldn't impact the air we typically breathe. It appears that releasing it into the ocean is more hazardous than into the atmosphere, so releasing it into the atmosphere might be preferable, as it ascends directly to elevated altitudes. Nonetheless, the majority of these 5 solutions have been dismissed because there are essentially no successful precedents, and nearly all solutions, with the exception of diluting with seawater, are exceedingly costly and time-consuming. That is to say, things that are neither verified nor cost-effective are basically abandoned and cannot be done. So considering everything, the International Atomic Energy Agency gave a conclusion in 2019 which was actually quite ambiguous. They said that there are no feasible solutions other than discharging into the ocean or atmosphere, meaning that solutions other than discharging into the ocean and atmosphere are basically not feasible. However, he didn't say that discharging it into the ocean or atmosphere is acceptable. He also emphasized that if Japan intends to discharge it into the ocean or atmosphere, it must be subject to continuous monitoring. This means that every ton of water and every liter of air discharged may need to be tested to see if the pollutants exceed our required standards. Furthermore, it was emphasized that if a better solution is found over the years or decades of discharge, it should be switched to immediately, rather than continuing the current discharge method. If a better solution is found, it should be immediately switched to, rather than continuing with the current method. From this conclusion, everyone can see, right? After 10 years of discussion, the International Atomic Energy Agency has basically not found a better solution. The core issue here, and what we might be most concerned about, is how harmful this treated water actually is, right? In principle, if the levels of radioactive substances in this treated water meet the requirements of the Atomic Energy Agency, from a scientific perspective, discharging this water into the ocean is not a problem because, after all, there are possibly over 400 reactors currently operating worldwide. Nuclear reactors are discharging normally, right? They didn't mention it's from Japan, which would surprise everyone. The issue is psychological, right? This is Japan's biggest pressure now. The main pressure for Japan in releasing nuclear wastewater isn't from the international community, it's from within Japan. The Japanese public disagrees with discharging this water. Even if the Fukushima plant were releasing harmless plain water, everyone would still be anxious, right? Everyone would feel anxious, right? Especially if you're releasing water with radioactive substances, right? If Japan begins the process of discharging, then not only Japanese seafood, but also all agricultural products and even various other products might endure a significant blow to their exports. Individuals might cease importing them, and it's not solely about halting imports, correct? This economic impact could potentially influence the entire global economy. In other words, even if the discharge aligns with international standards, individuals might still harbor concerns that there could be radioactive substances present in the ocean, leading them to refrain from consuming seafood. The seafood worldwide might be affected, and Lao Gao, who has been living in Japan since the Fukushima nuclear plant accident, has personally experienced that Fukushima's agricultural products are basically unsellable. In the supermarket, I always see Fukushima's products left on the shelves. When there's an option to exchange for something of equal value, like chives or cabbage, people tend to avoid choosing Fukushima products. However, recently it has been somewhat better. It's already been 10 years and people might gradually care less about this issue. However, if Japan discharges nuclear wastewater again this time, Fukushima might be hit once more, reminding everyone of this matter. If Japan proceeds with the discharge, it's not just a health impact issue, but more significantly an economic one. As for the health impact, it's hard to say for sure. If it meets international standards, the possibility of no health impact exists, but the economic blow is certain. That's why Japan's fisheries union, with hundreds of thousands of people, has signed a petition to protest this matter. Another issue is the reason why many people oppose Japan's plan to discharge nuclear wastewater. Back in 2018, Japan had already stored over 100 tons of treated nuclear water. However, tests revealed that 70% of it had not been properly treated and still contained radioactive substances other than tritium, which is quite serious, right? So, after this was discovered, the nuclear power plant immediately conducted a re-evaluation and found that there was an error in their treatment process, which resulted in a lot of water not being properly treated. So they immediately reprocessed everything. Now it has fully met the standards, but because they made such a mistake, it has led to a lack of trust among the Japanese public and the international community. However, the International Atomic Energy Agency has been monitoring this situation all along. Their stance is that if Japan does proceed with the discharge, they will be responsible for supervising it to ensure that truly destructive nuclear materials will not be discharged into the ocean. Honestly, I believe that although this responsibility lies with Japan, ultimately the whole world might need to lend a hand because it affects all of humanity, right? Besides, I hope everyone doesn't get overly anxious about this matter, as worrying is of no use. The monitoring of this issue is ultimately in the hands of international investigation teams or the International Atomic Energy Agency, so, well, we can only trust them. Being overly anxious about this is kind of like what, for example, when you're flying and the flight attendant keeps telling you, last year there was a plane crash, and 15 years ago there was another crash where everyone died. Hearing that would make you afraid to fly, right? You'd immediately switch to taking a car. In reality, the accident fatality rate for cars is much higher than for planes, isn't it? What we can do is just focus on living our lives. If we want to completely solve this problem, unless all the nuclear power plants in the world are shut down, it really can't be resolved, right? But it seems that there is no inclination to shut everything down completely at the moment, right? Okay, so today I've explained a bit about the issues currently facing the Fukushima nuclear power plant. I hope that this time, since it was caused by a natural disaster, we can overcome this challenge with the joint efforts of all humanity. Well, let's end here for today. See you next time. Bye-bye.